What movie?
Poltergeist. What we're talking about?
That's what we're talking about.
Yeah.
Forgive me as I battle a virus.
A virus.
Yeah.
It's like what's his name? Kevin Kline in I Love You to Death. Just get a little virus.
Oh, yeah. What, for a virus?
Divo.
I will say that movie
makes me always want a pizza every time I watch, like that opening credits.
My god, yeah.
Credit
Just
sequence.
Italian food of any kind.
Yeah.
Like I just wanna dig in.
Definitely.
Like even just a bowl of pasta or something. Like gives me some Italian nostalgia.
I got
I just got to snap into that Super Mario.
Super Mario.
Yeah, because he's Italian.
I know, but
Well, you're having trouble with the voice, so it's.
no.
his voice
I was
act.
talking about what to say. I mean, I always had trouble with the voice, but I was referring to my dumb attempt at trying to make a new word by combining Italian and nostalgia into Italiagia or something like that.
Italian.
This house is clear.
This house is beer.
Oh, are you drinking a beer right now?
No, it's an aha.
Oh. You ruined the joke.
I did.
The joke.
You ruined it.
Completely ruined that joke. 100%.
I do really, really love Poltergeist. It's honest to God one of my all-time favorites.
That's what
Not
we're
even
talking
just
about.
for... allegedly.
Allegedly.
Illegibly.
Yep.
But yeah, not just for the movie itself, but we've talked once or twice the curse of the Poltergeist and all like the weirdness that happened in the years following making the movie. Largely suspected that you brought this up. I wasn't sure about this. I thought maybe this was a hard fact, but I just double check, dot my T's, cross my I's. I checked into it. It is a matter of factual record that they did use real human remains for the production design, and I was like, well, that's a little.
Well, I always heard again, I never took the time to confirm it,
But I always heard that was the rumor, or that was the story, that it was
cheaper to just get
real corpses, skeletons, whatever, cadavers, than it was to make fake ones. And I'm like, wow.
Well, in either regard, they would have had to have had the real skeletons. They would have had to have cast the rubber molds off of them.
Yeah.
So it was kind of like they just kind of cut the middleman out and put the real thing in there. And it was a bit of a cut corner that a lot of people attribute to being the cause of some of these freak scenarios with some of the cast and crew in the years following that seemed to kind of all align to the quote unquote curse.
Yeah. When was the first time? When do you think you were the first time you saw it?
Definitely, like several others, I was way too young to be watching this movie. But I want to say I was probably like somewhere between 8 and 10 when I saw it the first time.
Okay. I saw it a little bit later. I didn't see it till high school for the first time. I don't know why. I had always heard about it, just never came across the TV or something for me a little bit later.
One of the ones that they used to play a lot on like AMC Horror Fest, and I got way down the spiral come October, September when they would run that. I'd run home to school every day just to catch what they were showing. I would like check the TV guides and stuff, be like, oh, what are they playing tonight? It's my favorite.
Poltergeist. Or, not to be confused, rather, with the Chicken Run sequel.
Poltergeist.
Poltergeist.
What an American classic that is.
That is, yes. Not to be confused with the Chicken Run sequel or epilogue, Poltergeist.
Well, there's the Chicken Run bit, but there's also an actual horror film called Poltergeist.
There is?
Yeah. And let me double check.
See, that's like one of those things. Anytime you come up with something, you have to assume, just by the law of averages, that at least 100 other people have the same idea.
Yeah, for sure. It was kind of in the vein. Do you remember? I don't know if I ever talked to you about this. Do you remember Thanksgiving?
Thanksgiving. That sounds familiar, but I don't think I've ever heard it.
It's a weird one.
Seen it.
It's like the demon of like an Indian burial ground overtakes the body of a Thanksgiving Day turkey and starts terrorizing this American family out of vengeance. It's meant to be a total farce, not like a legit horror movie, but it's ridiculous. And then and it was so ridiculous that they made...
That sounds amazing.
They made a sequel to it called Thanksgiving 3. They didn't do a Thanksgiving 2. They went straight to 3 and involved puppets. It was just totally absurd.
Thanksgiving 3, Revenge of the Leftovers.
Yes.
Thanksgiving 2, Too Much Tryptophan. Thanksgiving 4, Cranberries and Yams. Thanksgiving 5, Pumpkin Pie. Thanks Killing 6. That's it. That's all I got for now.
Oh my gosh.
So anyway,
the horror film Poltergeist is Poltergeist: Night of the Chicken Dead.
Night of the Chicken Dead. Oh my god! Again,
and it's the poster is a human skull with a chicken head bursting out of the top of it.
They're getting into different ones there.
Yeah, utter and complete classic, made in 2006. Ridiculous. For Poltergeist, 1982.
Yeah.
Was common misconception about Poltergeist is it was not in fact directed by Steven Spielberg. I myself used to make that mistake a lot when I first caught on to it. I always because he produced it.
Yeah,
and his name is all over the front.
And his name is attached to it, so it's understandable. Yeah,
yeah. He was originally scheduled to direct it, and actually, interestingly enough, it wasn't a ghost story in its original drafts and versions. It was originally written to be a sequel to Close Encounters.
See, that's strange. I never knew that it was going to be.
Yeah,
I never even knew they wanted to do a sequel for Close Encounters.
Yeah, it went through a long writing process where it's one of those ones where it just kind of kept evolving and changing. Because not unlike Blade Runner, how Blade Runner was originally meant to be just a total adaptation of the Phil K. Dick novel, where it fully evolved into something else. Mm-hmm. Tobe Hooper was roped in to direct. Part of why it stayed in such a long writing process was because Spielberg was originally attached to direct it. He got involved with E.T., and because of his contractual obligations, making sure E.T. was tied up and ready to go, his schedule just kept pushing it. To get it going, Tobe Hooper stepped in to pull a lot of things together in the pre-production process, so it became Tobe Hooper's movie. Tobe Hooper, who before this worked on Texas Chainsaw Massacre, we had discussed how Texas Chainsaw is kind of like argued as the original slasher movies. So, I mean, Tobe Hooper is no stranger to the horror genre.
So he wasn't like coming into this. And that's always an interesting thing. He wasn't coming into this having not worked in the horror genre before. Like, would you say that not writing, because I've actually never tried to write anything that would even get close to borderline horror, and would it be tough to just start to do that out of nowhere?
I would imagine, yeah.
I mean, I would think so. I mean, especially, too, because there's certain, like, levels of horror, too. And, like, because there's moments... I would say Poltergeist, for me, definitely has... And there are some parts that you could argue maybe it hasn't aged as well as other things, but not. I think for the most part, it still holds up.
Yeah. Well, yeah, like the original draft having been coming out of this other version of it where it was originally an alien story and crossing into, the idea was that they would still kind of be like that borders of another reality.
Yeah.
And it kind of stretching
There's definitely that strange, that eeriness to it.
Yeah, clearly it evolved quite heavily out of that. But I mean, there are other origins to this as well. It was also in its ghost story form. It's largely attributed to being a remake of a specific episode of The Twilight Zone, and that also comes into the curse in another interesting way. I'll bring up here in a bit. But the Twilight Zone episode, Little Girl Lost, season 3, episode 26, is very... in a lot of my research, I've pulled this up in the past. It's attributed to being a remake of that, and Spielberg has his connections to Twilight Zone, obviously, so that does garner some weight.
I think too, like when you're writing something, you're gonna get ideas from everywhere, and it's a matter of like which ones you're gonna use, which ones you're gonna save for something else, which ones are gonna be the main focus, which are just gonna be a bit of like a smattering around the main story. You can always like start something out and then end up with something
completely different.
Yeah, completely different. But it's not a stretch to now that, especially from like, when I'm thinking of like the lighting, like there's a lot of sequences in Close Encounters that have definitely a fear element going on.
Oh, for sure. And just even the unknown.
Yeah.
They play a lot on, and I think that in a lot of Spielberg movies in general tend to deal in not knowing what's around that next corner and the anxiety and anticipation of that.
No, I would agree. Yeah.
There's definitely some lifeblood connective tissue between this and E.T. A lot of the time, I consider Poltergeist atmospherically a kind of a kindred spirit of E.T. in a lot of ways. They're both centered around suburbia and have children characters as a part of a larger family as their centerpiece to what's going on. But Poltergeist is kind of the darker side of that, whereas E.T. is heartwarming and, that has a very special central message to it. Poltergeist is much darker and much more sinister.
Did they come out the same year, too? 82? Were they both 82?
E.T. did come out the same year as Poltergeist, which is interesting considering that Poltergeist was on a delay as a result of E.T. So that I always find those timeline unfolding to be interesting. I do kind of consider Poltergeist to kind of be the dark sister project to E.T. in some ways, some atmospheric ways, and how it was written. And I mean, a lot of the elements to Poltergeist are very interesting. I mean, it has connective tissue to a lot of other big, well-known projects. I mean, we've talked in the past how the VFX crew has some connectivity between Ghostbusters and also, I've not mentioned before, there is some connection to Star Wars, which is interesting because like there was some heavy product placement for Star Wars in this, which I've always found fun and interesting.
Well, this was definitely the beginning of product placement too, I think. I think this was when it...
Yeah, around this time, like the 80s were big for that.
Yeah.
I think the studios were starting to get wise to the fact that they had ways and methods they can make some dough.
Some of that do-re-mi.
Do-re... Egon.
I knew you were going to do it.
You know me too well. But yeah, I mean, we've also talked in the past too. I mean, Michael Kahn edited this. I mean, he worked pretty extensively with Spielberg.
A great editor. Sometimes, I don't know, underappreciated, I think.
I think so too.
Yeah.
I mean, look at the body of work that he has under his resume. I mean, he's got an intuition about how long to hold, when to show, when to cut away. I mean, obviously a lot of that is baked into what's written and how it's put in front of the camera, but there's still a lot that can be added in that process that I don't think people take note of.
Well, he definitely, if I remember correctly, he cuts more on feeling. Like he's got the scene, and it's got, like you said, it's got to feel right when that's happening, and it almost it almost disappears because it feels more natural when you're watching it.
I think that's partly why it's sometimes, like Poltergeist specifically, sometimes can feel like a Spielberg movie because I mean, it has that snappy edit to it, and I think that's a credit to Michael Kahn and how he doesn't get quite as much notoriety as he probably should. I mean, you're talking about the guy who did all the Indiana Jones films, and what am I thinking? There's one specifically, Jurassic Park as well. So I mean, those are very snappily cut movies, very sharp in how they snap together. So,
and this is definitely too, I would say, horror. Well, any film genre really, but I would say
this one I think sits pretty firmly in that paranormal subgenre we discussed in the retrospective. It's not so much psychological as it is. I mean, the psychological as an element in any human story, but I think that this one, as far as the subgenres of horror, sits pretty like it's one of the ones that's pretty firmly a ghost story.
Yeah. And it's interesting, you mentioned it too, comparing it with the kin to E.T. It's that darkness intruding suburbia. I'm pretty sure the housing plan that they live in is built, it's brand new, right?
Oh yeah. Within like a certain number of years. Yeah. So it's like they're rolling this out in like certain phases. So it's like you get a lot of that information from Craig T. Nelson's character discussing with the new tenants as well as him discussing with the owner of that housing development.
Yeah.
They kind of talk about how it's coming out and they're starting phase 5, and pretty soon you won't be able to distinguish phase 5 from blah, blah, blah.
Yeah. So there's definitely that element of intruding upon, be it something paranormal or even just nature too, of how they're developing the plans. Of course, spoilers here if you've never seen the movie.
Yeah, I think that should go for this whole episode.
Yeah, the big reveal, of course, like you have the family haunted by these ghosts, and of course one of the main characters, the little girl, is essentially their first, I don't want to say target, but essentially the one that meets them for the first time, or the one that they're going after, and she ends up getting caught in their dimension. And while they're trying to get her back, really like this battle ensues between the family trying to get her back and the ghosts wanting her essence, her life, because she has what the ghosts want.
It's pretty apparent from the get-go that opening scene with the Star Spangled Banner, which interestingly enough is kind of like a time capsule moment for the 80s, where I have like such a brief memory of this being the case for cable television back in the day. It was not around long for when I was a kid, but you didn't have the 24-hour cycle of TV. Like after, I think it was 9 or 10 o'clock, everything just went static.
Yep.
Through the rest of the night until the morning news, it was all just
it was done. Yeah,
nothing.
You had that white noise going on.
Yeah, so it really played into that. Lived in that area in a very interesting way.
Well,
and I think like they use that well to kind of introduce that Carol Ann is intuitive to this other plane and has an attachment to it, and that's how they're able to spot her so early on why she's such a target for them.
Well, I think it's definitely one of those movies that even if you're not necessarily frightened by it, and I would say, I mean, it has a few jump scares. I mean, it definitely does, but I feel like it relies more on thinking about
who you calling moron.
It relies heavily on asking the questions, or like sort of alluding and forcing you to ask the questions yourself, like, what happens after you die? Is there another plane? It's definitely one of those stories where the themes of it, I think, are the most chilling parts to it.
Absolutely. And like we've talked before, it's that atmosphere of horror tends to be its most forefront aspect. And I think that this movie has atmosphere in spades, which is shocking for a movie that has a crew behind it that is so hyper technically oriented.
Yeah.
The ones who are so technically precise manage to make a movie that is so atmospheric.
Yeah, and this is long before CGI and computers, or at least what we would consider it today.
A lot of the same people who created Back to the Future and Jurassic Park movies that visually are so like technically sharp. But it's like this one kind of sits in a slightly different category because it's dealing with that's why I think, Indiana Jones gets a lot of its successes, because it has some similar visual themes and things going on, especially in Raiders, just attaching to the other plane and seeing behind the veil, as it were, and not being so hyper into the real world, so to speak.
Yeah, and I was not shocked, but I had forgotten that Jerry Goldsmith did the score for this.
Yeah, Jerry Goldsmith is probably the greatest of all time. That is a very, very loose thing to say because there are so many greats out there.
Careful what you're saying.
I consistently go back to Jerry Goldsmith, though. I love the score for The Mummy. I love this score very much, especially his work through Star Trek. I mean, that original score for the Star Trek motion picture, especially. Some of the themes in there and just some of the instruments that he used. He was very experimental, used instruments and things that were just so unorthodox and out of the norm.
He was
willing to try anything.
And I mean this in a good way. And no pun intended, but if I had to describe Jerry Goldsmith's scores in one word, I would use the word haunting. And,
oh my gosh, yeah.
There's just that, and it doesn't always have to be in a terrifying way. It can just be even like a sense of longing, but there is that, and haunt, literally the word just means when you frequent a place, like an old haunt. It only became a little bit later, it meant to be like haunted by ghosts, because where are they going to go? They frequent that place, hence why something's haunted. But for me, that quality of it, I mean it as a compliment to his work, when I say that they're haunting, in the sense that I tend to find myself going back to those scores a lot, and they stick with me. I frequent.
Weirdly enough, I did a rewatch for this, and what I noticed about the score specifically was that this is, in my opinion, one of Goldsmith's most, at times, obviously, one of his most innocent scores. There's the capturing of that suburbia and the air of just like the whimsical curiosity of the children.
Yeah.
At times, I even look at like toy soldiers and stuff that he had done in the past. It's like where like kids are like the entirety of that movie. It's like the military overtones in that don't ever really let the childlike curiosity come fully into the forefront. And I'm like, it's interesting to me that Poltergeist, one of the most threatening movies of all time, has some of the most innocent, interesting.
Oh, and the sound, like, I mean, just to have that too. And I can't think of recently horror movies that have used score to their advantage as much as some of the older ones have.
Yeah, especially like I think Jerry Goldsmith, if you track his career, it's interesting how he has lent a lot of credibility to some movies that he's worked on. I think he has helped a lot of movies stand out in ways that other collaborators kind of haven't. I think if you look through like his catalog, it's interesting, like especially like this and The Mummy, movies like that. I mean, obviously Poltergeist has like a ton of weight behind it creatively, but I mean, The Mummy, you're looking at a fairly new director. A lot of that cast was not proven up until that point, and that score for The Mummy just gives it so much creative weight.
Yeah,
I think that coupled with the locations and the visuals they were able to pull off with The Mummy, I mean, just sell that movie 1,000%. It's why I think it's endured 30 years, isn't it?
For Poltergeist?
about 25 years. No, I was speaking specifically of the
Oh,
Mummy.
the Mummy, yeah.
But I mean, the Mummy is coming up on about 25-ish years at this point. I mean, that movie's stood some time here.
Just in time.
Still kick it around. Just first name Justin, last name Time.
Yeah. So let's talk about the
big elephant in the room.
The big ghost in the closet. The big No, that works.
Yeah, I like it.
It's topical for the movie.
Yeah, I think so.
Let's talk about
just the curse, as it were.
The curse of Poltergeist.
Yeah, so this is a lengthy topic. I wanted to be sure I got a lot of this correct because there is a lot of speculation on this and a lot of things. So all of these, I want to forefront this, are to be taken with a grain of salt.
Okay.
I mean, but it is the wealth of like the amount of these types of occurrences and things that give them weight. It's like, yes, some of these may be bogus and made up, but I think given the amount of things that have gone wrong in the years since this movie was produced and released, I think it's pretty undeniable that it's cursed. I think
we already talked about sort of one of them with the real skeletons in the final sequence.
Yeah, so this is people who firmly believe this and push this whole theory forward attribute it to the fact that the production used real skeletons in the production in way like they dressed them up, drowned them, and did all kinds of unspeakable things to these human remains for the production of the movie. It's largely attributed as desecrating the remains of the dead, and the anger that their souls are bringing upon the cast is what's causing all of this.
Which is strange because that's exactly what they do in the movie. What I was alluding to
It's
earlier.
kind of like Jurassic Park with the production mistakes. It's like it leans into the themes of the movie, which is so interesting. The first example, and one of the ones that's the most interesting by far, is the case of Dominique Dunne. She played the eldest sister of the family,
which has her famous. One of her famous scenes in the movie is now certainly meme heavy.
Oh, yeah.
What's happening?
And then she has the hickey on her neck and she's standing in the middle of the street while everything's exploding.
Oh, yeah.
That end sequence of the movie is fascinating.
Yeah.
It's the implosion of the house, the practical effects for how they did that are incredible. Still one of the coolest things that's ever been put on film by far. But yeah, in the case of Dominique Dunne, as it relates to the quote unquote curse of the Poltergeist, I mean, I don't believe I think it was after the movie was released. It was the same year as the release. She had previously moved in with her boyfriend, who was, by accounts of people who knew him and her, very standoffish, very odd, very weird. He ended up getting very angry with her during an argument that the two of them had, and in the heat of that situation, he strangled her to death and killed her.
That is just like, I mean, that alone is like, what the hell?
And she was the daughter of some pretty notable people within the industry. I mean, she was definitely going to have a career ahead of her, and especially given that they made Poltergeist into a franchise, she would have been kicking around that at the very least. But it was a very strange occurrence that happened right around during the year that this movie was released. She didn't even really get time to bask in the success of it.
Did they meet? Had she already been dating this boyfriend prior to filming Poltergeist?
They had been dating since '81, so I'm not exactly sure of the production schedule in relation to that. It would have been in proximity of the time of that, but it was stated that she had moved in about 1981 and that she was killed in '82, so it wasn't a very long period of time. So that's just the first of these. There's several. If we move on to the case of Heather O'Rourke, who played Carol Ann.
Yeah.
There was a long audition process to find who they were going to cast as Carol Ann for the movie, and they had been looking pretty extensively at Heather O'Rourke's older sister. She was strongly considered for the role. The other, I think there were several in contention at the time. Drew Barrymore was one of them.
Oh, really? Drew Barrymore was? I didn't.
She was being strongly considered for the role.
She ends up getting the T role then, I'm assuming.
Yeah, so it was kind of curious. It was like definitely like something was seen in her during those auditions, but it was actually Spielberg that found Heather O'Rourke after her sister's audition. I guess they were eating lunch or something in proximity of the audition process, and Spielberg was walking around, found her, just kind of did like a light in passing discussion with her, talked to her, and after a short discussion, he realized that she was their Carol Ann and put her in the movie. Which was interesting that he was the one specifically a founder, but she managed to carry a lot of the franchise going forward into the next sequels for Poltergeist. But it was in 1988, some years after that first movie, that she died suddenly. I think she was 12 when she died.
Wait, really? She did?
Yeah, she was super, super young. It was tragic.
Wow.
It was utterly shocking for everyone. It's showed up in a lot of medical television that I've seen it in. A lot of like autopsy cases and stuff bring it up. But it was a very bizarre medical case. She actually had a bowel obstruction that led to 2 cardiac failures, and it was the heart condition that actually got her.
Jeez.
But yeah, it was a utterly tragic and just utterly bizarre scenario that happened.
Did they ever come, I guess they got the obstruction and all that, but did they ever come up to why that obstruction happened in the first place?
I believe it's been stated, but I mean those things do happen, but it's not common, especially in children, that it leads to that drastic of a failure. So it was utterly heartbreaking for the family and cast of the movies. But yeah, it was rough. I mean, there were tons of other things. I mean, Oliver Rubens, who played her slightly older brother Robbie, during the production of the first movie, a scene where the clown doll attacks Rob, they shot some reverse photography for that, when the arms wrap around his neck and are trying to kill him. Weirdly enough, that stunt, one of the takes that they were running it, actually went haywire, and the crew did not notice this occurring. And as the story goes, I mean, it's noted that Spielberg caught that this was happening before anybody else rushed in, ruined the take, and got Robbie out of there. And it's largely suspected that had he not been there and noticed, the actor Oliver Rubens would not have fared so well coming out of that. So, and then there's other types of things. There was a report of, I think it was in the second or third movie, there was a pyrotechnic effect that was coming through and lit a fireball that allegedly, according to some of the crew, the fireball itself chased people around the set in an erratic manner. Now, see, some of these, I don't know how much credence I give, but I mean, it is interesting the volume of these that have come out.
Well, you think too, people once the idea of a curse is created, then people start to feed into it.
It tends to be somewhat self-fulfilling. I mean, also Zelda Rubinstein stated that during I think it was the production of the second I think it was the third one, because she's the main star of the third movie. She claimed that when her photograph was taken, she was blinded and saw streaks of light, and claimed to be followed by a presence made of light. All these types of things surrounding that. But what was really interesting was that during the taking of this photograph, it's alleged to be within the time frame that her mother passed away.
Huh.
So I found that quite interesting.
Well, and then not creepy at all.
Yeah, I know, right? It's just odd. And the last really big one that I consider to be notable of this was I haven't found many people that attribute this to this, but I connect these dots personally.
Okay.
The tragedy of the Twilight Zone movie. Have you looked into this?
No, this one, yeah. No, I have no clue what this one is.
So during the production of the Twilight Zone movie, which Spielberg was involved with, one of the members of the cast was actually killed, and they actually had to shut down production for quite a while. It was a water-based tank scene where a helicopter had crashed, and they had this whole setup, and it malfunctioned. The helicopter blade snapped and removed. It flew into the set and ended up dicing the actor.
What?
Yeah. And really one of the only main connective pieces of tissue there is Spielberg, but at the same time, it was and also what I attribute to be partly connective tissue was the fact that this was based off of a lot of people attribute it to being based off of or adapted from that episode of The Twilight Zone that we had previously mentioned.
Yeah.
Episode 26 of season 3, The Little Girl Lost. It's an interesting episode, worth watching if you get the chance. I mean, that whole show is great. Yeah, just it raises questions. It tends to have a head scratchy.
I know, and you don't. Related. It's one of those things. The more you start to get into it, the more you start to convince yourself it is real.
Yeah, and like we said, I mean, it could be very much well be a self-fulfilling whatever. The more you dig into it, the more you affirm it to yourself. But grain of salt, take that for what you will.
Well,
and I part of why I wanted to do this episode on this is that we had talked previously about the restoration for Jaws.
Yeah,
a lot of the same people who worked on that Jaws restoration. This was their most recent work. They did a full deep dive process on restoring this just this last year. and put out a very, very interesting and well done 4K remaster of this that I think may be the cleanest and most efficient remaster of a film so far back that I can think of.
Okay.
I mean, that 4K print is clear.
How do they, like, when they do that process, is it, I'm assuming they have to take the actual film first, no?
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of different ways that this is done, but I think that the team that worked on this, and especially that worked on Jaws, have it down pat. They have that process for movies of that time period, the best way to do it, because they do what I've heard as described as a cross analog digital process. Basically what that means is they're scanning in the negatives to make a digital master of those, and they're using different prints because the prints age differently over time and have different irregularities at different points in the movie. So using different film prints as well as that digital process, they basically they'll, for lack of a better term, Photoshop each individual frame.
Yeah.
Taking pieces from the frames before, frames after, such as things like that. Or they'll go into the original visual effects plates as much as they are able to do, and they can adjust things from there as well. But yeah, it's a very interesting process. I highly encourage looking into it if you're all interested, because I think it's one of the coolest jobs out there for film.
Yeah, well, speaking of like processes and techniques, I did not know, and you brought this to my attention, that the effects on this, the visual effect, were used then, or not used, but I should say done by the same team, which eventually go on to do Ghostbusters.
Yeah, Richard Edlund, if memory serves. Yeah, his a lot of the people who worked with him, this obviously given Spielberg's connections with ILM, Raiders and the indie movies, and his friendship with George Lucas. He had a lot of connections there he was able to bring in that tied Poltergeist to this, but I find the production schedule of Ghostbusters to be just one of the craziest things that's ever happened. Yeah. Basically, just under anticipated what he was going to need, and was his own worst enemy in that way, unfortunately. But he still managed to achieve one of the best movies ever in Ghostbusters. So his efforts were not in vain for sure. But yeah, Richard Edlund and a lot of his colleagues basically crossed the street from Poltergeist onto Ghostbusters. And I think that's one of the things that gives Ghostbusters its credibility as a horror comedy, is it has some of the best visuals from Poltergeist. Not to say that they actually took information from there, but I mean, like, the same methods, a lot of the same ideology on how to produce those images.
Yeah.
They took into Ghostbusters, and it has a lot of the same credence. So I think that's why Ghostbusters, one of the main reasons Ghostbusters is as good as it is because it looks as good as one of the best ghost stories ever told.
Well, yeah, and there is something about those effects in Ghostbusters, in Poltergeist, like I was saying. I think the only one that for me doesn't hold up is the famous, I don't know if it's famous, but the scene where one of the university professors or their intern is like staying up late, and they're trying to like catch anything, get data, and he goes to the bathroom and just wash his face, and he
starts pecking his face.
Yeah,
that scene is
you could tell
so
that
hokey.
You can tell that is, I mean, the concept of that is horrifying. You can tell that is a dummy though now.
That scene has definitely given me nightmares.
But yeah, no, it still gives me nightmares as well. But apart from that effect, everything else, like, I still think holds up. Like the shot at the end when the mother is running down the hallway, the hallway all of a sudden.
That one of my favorite photographic effects in the movie. That push pull.
Yeah.
Whew, so good. Basically, like, what a push pull is, just so it's stated, is where you dolly the camera in, zoom out, and rack focus all simultaneously to shrink and crush the focal plane, so that your depth of field just massively increases through the course of the shot, and it creates this effect. It's a very difficult effect to pull off analog by hand. Anybody who's tried it will tell you it's not an easy task. It takes a lot of practice and knowledge of what lens you're shooting on in order to achieve that. But if you can nail it, it can produce. I mean, Jaws is the most famous example of it. The snap zoom on Brody's character on the beach. I mean, it's just that's the most notable example. But that I think used to a very great anxiety-inducing effect in that hallway.
Yeah. And then she, like, is that supposed to be, what is she running into? I mean, it's frightening, that ghost that's blocking the doorway.
I commonly hear that referred to as the lion ghost or like the gatekeeper. A lot of people will call it. But I believe that the sound effect for that is the MGM lion.
It is? Oh,
because this is an MGM produced film. I believe that they use that sound.
No, because like how did they actually?
So yeah, the process for which they made that is pretty cool. I haven't been able to find any images on the setup for this, but they created a vacuum funnel and suspended the puppet for the lion gatekeeper inside the vacuum, and it created, I mean, they used this effect for a couple of different things in Poltergeist, but that's the most notable one I've heard of. And it's what they did with that was they were able to capture particle effects in the different planes of the photography. So it like added all this crazy atmosphere to it. And I think that's partly why some of the stuff in there looks as crazy good as it does. I mean, obviously it was credit to the lighting effects teams and everything, the methods by which those were composited together into the final footage. But I mean, it's those little touches and those little careful attentions to detail that can really make something stand the test of time.
No, absolutely. I mean, I have to say there is something about actually having something in front of the camera or something real.
Absolutely. It takes a lot, and it's not easy work, and that's partly why, not to say CGI is better or worse in any category. I think it's the right tool for the right job. I think not having computer graphics effects, forcing people to do things in camera and find inventive ways, having those rails to be forced creativity in some ways that aren't forced today.
No, agreed.
That's not to say computer graphics are inherently bad. That's not to say things are done worse nowadays. It's merely to say I think that people were forced to find impossible solutions to impossible problems back in the day, whereas it's more accessible to do so now.
Well, and it kind of ties back into that theme of the movie, respecting the dead, but respect for nature, in that at the climax of the movie, the father, the realtor boss comes in, and that's when it's discovered that, and it's hinted at earlier in the movie, that they were building on top of a graveyard the whole time, these new housing developments. And rather than actually exhume and find another resting place for the bodies, they just took out the headstones. And he has that like great, I do remember that, like, you son of a, you left the bodies,
didn't you?
You left the bodies, but you only took out the headstones. And like he says it in such a great, like, you could really sense his anger and like in that scene. He's like, why? I'm giving it a very poor reenactment here.
In contrast to that scene, I love the initial scene where the housing development head comes over and speaks with Craig T. Nelson's character, and just all these like goofy, weird things are happening in the house, and he's like, Craig T. Nelson's ushering him through the house, like, and he's just not noticing all these crazy things that are happening around him.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, they used that Spielberg comedy quite well here and there. That's not to take anything away from Tobe Hooper, but there were some noticeable Spielberg touches in there.
And there's that little nugget at the very end too, when they go to stay in a hotel. They get in, they shut the door, and then the father comes back out and pushes the TV back out.
I think that's such a good button.
Yeah.
Rejecting all this stuff that has made everything go wrong.
Well, yeah, so too, like, again, not necessarily a rejection of modernity, but also being cautious of technology, cautious of doing certain things without asking, okay, why are we doing it? Should we do this?
It's interesting because I think that static, like television static from tube TVs that were of back in the day, I think it is fascinating. I think both this and The Ring tapped into that very well, because static from TV, what that actually is, can't be described. It is literally just a capturing of the quote unquote ether and all this, it's just unscrambled general noise from the atmosphere. And we don't know exactly what it is. So I've always found that interesting. I think it does tie well into the themes of ghost stories, and it is interesting that we've kind of scrubbed that out of our culture.
Yeah, it's definitely one to watch. It's an interesting ghost story too. Did they ever find out, like, how did they settle on the term? I guess just because poltergeist in and of itself, like poltergeist activity, it fits the definition. But was there any other titles floated around before they settled on poltergeist? Because I'm thinking early 80s, I don't feel like that would have been a term, certainly not then, as iconic and as used as much now as today, thanks to this franchise. So I am curious how
I don't believe that there was a title in play for when this was Close Encounters sequel.
Mm-hmm.
But as far as I know, the only release title was Poltergeist. And I mean, it was meant to differentiate this from other haunting type stories of the time.
Yeah.
It did its job in differentiating the movie and setting it apart. But I do think the ultimate message of Poltergeist and its ultimate legacy, from as we discussed, that they did use real human remains and did actually perform one of the cardinal sins that the movie is damning is, I think that the ultimate message is to respect the dead and have a reverence for being at rest and being at peace.
Yeah, some sense of keeping some things, sacred.
Yeah, and I think the message of the film stands even more firmly in the cultural zeitgeist as a result of the curse that has lived on the movie, and definitely, if you believe such things, definitely shaken the lives of many in the wake of that franchise's existence.
I mean, it gets used a lot too. Like, it has certainly entered our pop culture, whether people, I think that is too, maybe I want to say a bit of the sad part behind it is a lot of movies that you and I grew up watching. I feel like people know them more. They're popular now more for elements than rather the full story. I don't know. I could be wrong on that.
Well, yeah, too. I mean, I was looking up and researching this. I found a list of times this had been referenced, and I was utterly not shocked, but I was just like, wow, this is a long list.
Yeah.
I think South Park alone had like 20 or so episodes that referenced this movie. I was like, that's a lot. And there was obviously Family Guy and all the Seth MacFarlane comedies had their touch on it. The Simpsons and those nighttime family comedies. But
well, no, too. And I'm trying to think, like, I don't think prior to this, well, no, you had Exorcist. So
Exorcist, yeah.
Yeah. So like, this is definitely, I don't know if you want to, like, this is when I would say from the 70s and into the 80s when the horror genre came of age a little bit more, in at least in the film industry, if I can say that.
I think the 80s really woke horror up in a lot of ways, especially we've discussed the slasher film like exploded in the 80s. It became like the teenage popcorn film. Style in the 80s for sure. But I mean, there were obviously a lot of big ones, like this being one of the biggest ones that came out of this. This was definitely the most profitable horror film that came out in 82. All right, so it did beat out in spades financially The Thing. I mean, The Thing was utterly perfect horror film, but it was destroyed by this financially. The Thing
I think
failed.
that's having Spielberg attached to it.
Yeah, Spielberg was a name for sure. He garnered a lot of weight, but I mean, Blade Runner and The Thing released the same day and both flopped hard.
Wow, I didn't realize they released the same day.
Yeah, I think that's one of the coolest things about the two of those is like it was June 25th, 1982. Both that and The Thing were released, both flopped hard. And they're two of the most longstanding, notable films like ever.
So that just goes to show you, don't ever because if a movie doesn't rake in a ton of money, it doesn't necessarily make it a bad movie, and vice versa.
Yeah, vice versa, indeed. I mean, you've discussed that one a couple of times here, and I mean, the box office can be very fickle, especially in recent years. But I mean, it is not a formula to be figured out. It is just the world does what the world is going to do, and you can't predict it.
Yep. Oh, excuse me.
God bless.
They're gone.
Yeah, I was trying to figure out. There's a movie that's playing in Poltergeist, and I cannot find what it is. I did some pretty deep dives, and I could not find what it was.
Yeah, I have no idea.
My original thought was that it was Little Girl Lost, but I don't believe that it is.
Well, that would make sense.
Yeah, that's what my initial thought was like, oh, okay, they brought this, but I don't think that's what it is. It's some other kind of ghost story. It's where it looked like a military pilot was killed and he wakes up in the afterlife, but I could not place or find it. I did some hefty research. I really did dig and try and find it, but I could not.
That sounds like a Twilight episode too.
It does, yeah. Like it very much looked like an episode. I was like, maybe it's another one that I'm not thinking of or can't remember, but I'm not sure. And there's so much great, like there's other great references to this. I mean, Breaking Bad actually, one episode they do reference this, and it's do you remember the beginning of Poltergeist where the RC cars are racing?
Yeah.
There's, I want to say, a season 5 episode of Breaking Bad where they have race cars in the street in front of Dean Norris's house.
Okay.
Uncle Hank. But I remember when Breaking Bad aired, and I noticed that, and I was like, wait a minute, I've seen this.
I have seen this.
Been here before. I have a memory of it. Yeah, it's one of those ones that has truly stood the test of time. I think it'll be around for years to come, especially given the nature of the curse and everything.
Yeah.
I mean, it's a very peculiar case, and I think all like the very substantial creative weight behind it. There's a lot to be learned from this movie, a lot to be studied and taken in. I mean, it's one for the ages.
Yeah.
I think it's one of the best that the '80s has to offer, personally, and I know it's that tree still haunts my nightmares.
Yeah, and definitely worth checking out with the spooky season coming up.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. And we're continuing to ride our 2-month spooky season wave here. So I'm excited about it.